I was set up. No way out. No second chances. Yesterday, I was just a regular guy. Today, I'm sitting in cuffs while a judge looks at me like I'm trash. They want me to stay quiet. But if they think this is the end, they're dead wrong. Let's start with how I got into this mess. The city at night was a beast with flickering neon eyes and a heartbeat of sirens. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm wailed, then abruptly cut off, like it knew better than to draw attention. The streets were still damp from a recent drizzle, and the air hung heavy with the mixed scents of gasoline, sweat, and something darker, something metallic. Then, a dull, wet thud. A sharp gasp, strangled and desperate. Another blow, harder, slicker. The kind of hit that didn't just break bone, it stole breath. Somewhere far beyond the alley, a police siren sliced through the night, but it wasn't close enough, not fast enough. A man lay crumpled on the cold pavement, his body sprawled in a way no body should be. The weak glow of the street lamp above cast sharp, cruel shadows over his face. Deep lines carved into weathered skin, silver hair streaked with blood. His coat, once undoubtedly expensive, was now just a torn, filthy mess, soaking up the grime from the pavement. Just inches from his outstretched fingers, a cell phone lay shattered, its screen cracked but still glowing faintly. An unfinished number glowed on the display, a call he never got to finish. The man gasped, sucking in air like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to life. His chest heaved once, then convulsed. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a sickening, wet gurgle. A deep, shuddering noise that didn't belong in a human throat. Blood pooled at the corners of his lips before trickling down his chin, soaking into the already ruined fabric of his coat. Then, footsteps. Fast. Urgent. A shadow lurched into view, skidding to a halt. Miles Carter, 35. Built like a linebacker, but faster on his feet than most men half his size. His breath came short and sharp, chest rising and falling too quickly as his eyes locked onto the broken body before him. For half a second, his brain refused to process what he was seeing. Then, like a rubber band snapping, reality crashed down on him. Clint, hey man, stay with me. Miles dropped to his knees, hands gripping the old man's shoulders. He gave him a slight shake, not too hard, just enough to keep him from slipping away. His pulse was hammering. His breath came out in ragged bursts. Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood, made a raw, broken sound deep in his throat. His fingers twitched, like he was reaching for something he couldn't quite grasp. Miles leaned in closer, straining to catch his words, but there were no words, just one last, shuddering exhale. And then, his body went still. Miles froze. His stomach dropped. This was bad. 15 minutes later, the street exploded with red and blue lights. The wail of sirens shattered the thick, suffocating silence of the alleyway. The hum of radio chatter filled the air, voices sharp and clipped, laced with the usual mix of urgency and boredom. The pavement gleamed slick under the flashing lights, reflecting distorted shadows of uniformed figures moving in tight, purposeful formations. Beyond the yellow crime scene tape, a small crowd had gathered. Half of them were holding up their phones, already recording. Miles stood off to the side, heart still racing, mind still reeling. Everything felt like it was happening in slow motion, like he was trapped in a bad dream and watching it unfold from outside his own body. He knew this looked bad, really, really bad. A tall cop broke away from the pack and approached him. White guy, mid-40s, mustache thick enough to be compensating for something. Cold blue eyes that looked like they'd seen a lot of things, but never felt anything about them. The guy flipped open a notebook, barely glancing up. Name? Miles's mouth was dry. His pulse pounded against his ribs. Miles Carter. The cop finally looked at him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. What were you doing here, Carter? Miles swallowed, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. I heard something. A fight. I ran over and found him like this. The cop raised an eyebrow. You know this man? Miles took a slow breath. Yeah, his name's Clint. Clint Eastwood. A beat of silence. The cop blinked, his head tilting slightly. You're messing with me, right? Miles exhaled sharply, his patience hanging by a thread. No, I am not messing with you. The officer's jaw clenched slightly. His gaze flicked toward his fellow cops, then back to Miles. Then, just like that, "All right, Carter, you're coming with us. Just a few questions." Miles felt his stomach twist. "Are you serious? I just told you. I found him like this." The cop's lips quirked up slightly, but there was no humor in it. "And you're the only black guy at the scene. Don't make this difficult." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Before he could even process them, two officers stepped forward, grabbed him, twisted his arms behind his back. What the cold bite of metal, the unmistakable click of the handcuffs. "Miles Carter, you're under arrest for assaulting a senior citizen." His blood boiled. "You're seriously arresting the first black guy you see? That's your whole case?" One of the cops, a younger guy with an attitude problem, smirked. "Man, you watch too much Netflix." Miles clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. He turned his head, catching one last glimpse of Clint's lifeless body on the pavement. This wasn't just bad. This was a setup. The air in the holding cell was thick, stale, and stank of sweat and regret. Miles Carter sat on the hard bench, his hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. The dim yellow light flickered overhead, casting weak shadows on the peeling paint of the walls. The entire room felt like it was designed to break people down, crush them, erase their dignity, make them nothing more than a number in a file. Across from him, two other guys lounged against the wall. One was slumped over, looking half asleep. The other, a wiry dude with too many tattoos and not enough muscle to back them up, stared at Miles like he was a new episode of a show he wasn't sure he liked yet. Miles didn't care. His mind was a tornado of questions, all spinning around one single burning thought. How in the world did I end up here? No evidence, no witnesses, no real reason. Just two cops who needed someone to cuff. And, apparently, he fit the bill. He wasn't stupid. He knew how this game worked. The system didn't care about facts. It didn't care about logic. It cared about closing cases and making numbers look good. And he was convenient. Right place, wrong time. Miles let out a slow breath, trying to steady himself, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw Clint's body on the pavement. And now, just because he had the bad luck of being the only black man near the crime scene, they had thrown him in a cage like an animal, and no one gave a damn. The next day, courtroom nightmare. Miles had barely gotten any sleep when they dragged him out of the cell the next morning. The courtroom was cold, not in temperature, but in feeling. Everything about it felt clinical, detached. The wood-paneled walls, the high ceiling, the way the judge barely even looked at him, like she had already made up her mind before he even opened his mouth. Sitting behind the bench was a woman in her 50s, sharp features, cold eyes, and lipstick so red it looked like she just drank a glass of wine and forgot to wipe her mouth. She sighed, flipping through the case file like she was bored out of her mind. "Miles Carter, you are being charged with aggravated assault against Clint Eastwood, resulting in serious bodily harm." Miles felt his jaw tighten. I didn't attack him. I found him like that." Before the judge could respond, the prosecutor spoke up. Miles turned his head and saw a tall man in a flawless navy blue suit, his hair slicked back so perfectly it looked like it was glued in place. He smiled, not a friendly smile, a shark's smile. "Then why were your fingerprints all over his clothing?" Miles's hands clenched into fists again. Because I was trying to help him, genius." The judge's hammer hit the desk. "Mr. Carter, addressed the prosecutor with respect." Miles took a slow breath, forcing himself to calm down. The judge adjusted her glasses and continued. "Do you have legal representation?" Miles exhaled. "No, but I assume I'll be assigned a public defender." The judge scribbled something down. "The court will appoint a defense attorney. Your preliminary hearing is scheduled for 1 week from today." Miles's stomach dropped. 1 week? You're making me sit in jail for something I didn't do? The judge finally looked up at him properly, her expression flat and unimpressed. "Not just showed. You have the option to post bail, $50,000. Miles stared. 50 what? I don't have that kind of money. The judge gave a small shrug, as if this was all just another boring case in a long line of them. Then you'll have to wait in custody, Mr. Carter. And with a sharp bang of her gavel, it was over. Case closed. Except for Miles, the case wasn't closed. It was just getting started. Back in the cell, Miles sat on the rock-hard cot, staring at the ceiling. His mind buzzed with anger, confusion, and frustration so thick it made his chest feel tight. He was innocent. He knew it. But in here, innocence didn't mean anything. A shadow passed over the bars of his cell. Miles looked up just as a guard approached. You got a visitor. Miles frowned, sitting up. Who? The guard smirked. Some old guy. Looks like he just walked out of a Western movie. Miles felt his blood run cold. There was no way. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stood up and followed the guard through the dimly lit hallway. They reached the visitation room, and Miles stepped inside. And there, sitting casually at the table, like he wasn't supposed to be half dead in an alley last night, was Clint Eastwood, alive. A white bandage wrapped around his forehead, but otherwise, he looked very much not dead. Miles froze. Clint glanced up at him, the corner of his mouth pulling into a smirk. Well, kid, looks like you've had a rough couple of hours. Miles just stared. What? How? Clint leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. Take a breath, Carter. You're in deep trouble, but don't worry. He grinned. I'm here to get you out. Miles froze, staring at Clint like he'd just seen a ghost. Because technically, he had. The last time he saw Clint Eastwood, the man was half dead in an alley, bleeding out under a street lamp. But here he was now, very much alive. He looked rough, yeah, but not should be in a morgue rough. His shirt was wrinkled, a fresh bandage wrapped around his forehead. But his eyes, sharp as ever. Miles swallowed hard. You're alive. Clint smirked. Yeah, and lucky for you, or else you'd be sitting in here for murder. Miles's chest tightened. Then why am I still in a cell? Why did they arrest me? Clint leaned in slightly, the shadows cutting across his face in a way that made him look like he had seen things. Dangerous things. Because someone wants you here. The reveal. Clint lowered his voice, his expression darkening. Listen, kid, I've been around this city a long time. I know how the gears turn, who's pulling the levers. Someone set this whole thing up. And trust me, this ain't just some random cop screw-up. This is planned, organized. Miles's jaw clenched. So you're saying I was framed? No, I'm saying if you don't start fighting back, they're going to bury you under this lie. A slow chill ran down Miles's spine. This wasn't just about bad luck. This wasn't just about being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Someone wanted him gone. You got proof? Clint chuckled, shaking his head. Proof? Kid, I got something better. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. This is a list. 4 names. You find them, you get answers. Miles took the paper and unfolded it. 4 names, written in quick, scrawled handwriting. 1. Rick Patterson, ex-cop. 2. Linda Grayson, waitress, works near the crime scene. 3. Carl Bishop, lawyer. 4. Detective Marcus Davis, the only good cop left in this mess. Miles's eyes flicked back up to Clint. How am I supposed to find them if I'm stuck in here? Clint just smirked. Don't worry about that. The breakout. Later that night, Miles lay on his rock-hard cot, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced, replaying every second of the past 24 hours like a broken tape. Arrested, framed, Clint alive. Then a metallic click. His eyes snapped open. The cell door creaked open. Miles sat up so fast, his head nearly hit the wall. His pulse hammered. A guard stood at the doorway, his face blank. Get up. You're being released on bail. Miles squinted, suspicion tightening his chest. No. Who paid? The guard didn't answer, just tilted his head toward the exit. Miles hesitated for half a second before swinging his legs off the cot and stepping forward. His muscles were still sore from sleeping on literal concrete, but his mind was awake. Wide awake. He walked out into the hallway, past the processing desk, past the other inmates staring at him through the bars like he had just won the lottery. None of this felt right. Then he saw him. Clint, standing in the dimly lit corner of the station, arms crossed, the same knowing smirk on his face. Miles stopped cold. "No way. You bailed me out?" Clint shrugged. "I did." Miles shook his head, his frustration bubbling up. "Why? You don't even know me." Clint pulled a cigar from his pocket, rolling it between his fingers. "I know enough. I know you didn't do it. And I know if you don't get to these people before they disappear, you're going away for a long, long time." Miles looked down at the list again. "Where do I start?" Clint met his gaze, his smirk fading into something more serious. "Rick Patterson, if he's still alive." 2:47 a.m. The old Chevy Impala rumbled down the deserted streets, its headlights barely cutting through the city's thick, hazy night air. Miles sat in the passenger seat, arms crossed, eyes flicking between the side mirror and the dimly lit streets. Outside, the city was still awake in all the worst ways. Drunken laughter echoed from a nearby alley, a distant siren howled, and somewhere, far enough to not matter but close enough to remind him where he was, a single gunshot cracked the night like a warning. He exhaled sharply and muttered, "What the hell am I doing?" Clint, hands firm on the wheel, didn't even blink. "Nah, you're surviving." The words sat heavy between them. They turned into a narrow alley, the pavement uneven and cracked, leading toward a run-down house with rusted bars on the windows and chipped paint peeling off the walls. Miles eyed the place with skepticism. "Rick Patterson actually lives here?" Clint sighed, rolling his shoulders before shifting the car into park. "Lived. If we're lucky, he's still breathing." The house of no return. Miles followed Clint up the cracked concrete steps. They knocked. Nothing. Clint's eyes narrowed. He tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. The silence in the house wasn't just normal nighttime quiet. It was dead quiet. Clint exhaled through his nose, reaching into his pocket. Miles squinted. "Wait, what are you doing?" Without answering, Clint pulled out a small, thin tool. Miles's eyebrows shot up. "Are you seriously about to break in?" Clint slid the pick into the lock, his fingers working with surgical precision. You want to stand out here and hope he decides to open up, or do you want to find some answers?" There was a click. The door creaked open. Miles shook his head. "You're way too good at that." Clint smirked. "Not my first time, kid." They stepped inside, and the smell hit them first. Something was wrong. Miles' stomach twisted. The air was thick with the heavy stench of something rotten. His instincts screamed at him to turn around and leave. Then he saw him, Rick Patterson, or what was left of him. The man was slumped in an armchair, head tilted slightly to the side, his eyes dull and unfocused, staring into nothing. His mouth was frozen mid-sentence, like his last words had been stolen from him, and his neck. A dark, deep gash stretched across his throat. Miles's breath hitched. Oh no." Clint crouched beside the body, his expression unreadable. He touched 2 fingers to the man's wrist, but they both already knew. Cold, lifeless, gone. Clint sighed. "He's been dead for hours. We're too late." Miles's jaw clenched as he stared at the lifeless body. "Someone's cleaning up, killing witnesses before they can talk." Clint didn't respond right away. His eyes had landed on something else, on the wall, written in blood, a message, short and deliberate. "Stay out." Miles's stomach turned. "Oh yeah, totally normal. Just your friendly neighborhood murder warning." Clint wiped his hands on his jeans, his eyes dark. "We're not stopping." Miles swallowed, stepping back from the body. "So what now?" Clint flicked his fingers toward him. "Now, we find Linda Grayson." The chase begins. They stepped outside, the night air feeling heavier than before. Miles climbed back into the passenger seat, his mind still spinning from what they'd just walked into. He exhaled, running a hand over his face. "I really, really hope we're not too late again." Clint didn't answer because his eyes were locked onto the rearview mirror, Uh, yeah, about that. Miles frowned. Then, headlights flooded the alley. 2 cars, coming fast. Miles's pulse skyrocketed. Hey, tell me that's just some unlucky coincidence? Clint threw the car into gear. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? The Chevy lurched forward, tires screeching against the pavement. Behind them, the 2 cars sped up, engines growling, getting closer. Miles's grip tightened on the dashboard. They're coming for us. Clint's foot slammed on the gas. The Chevy roared ahead, tearing out of the alley. The chase was on. 3:15 a.m. The Chevy Impala tore through the empty streets, the engine growling as Clint pressed the gas harder. Streetlights blurred past like ghostly figures, their glow barely enough to cut through the thick darkness of the city. The rearview mirror shook violently from the sheer speed they were hitting. Behind them, 2 black SUVs gained ground. Not cops, not random thugs. These guys had a purpose, and that purpose was catching them. Miles twisted in his seat, his heart pounding against his ribs. How many? 2 cars. And? You got a plan? Clint didn't answer immediately. Instead, he smirked and took a sharp right turn into a narrow alley. The tires screeched, the Impala barely fitting between the graffiti-covered walls. Miles braced himself, his breath hitching. Man, you better know what you're doing. Then suddenly, they weren't moving. Clint killed the engine and coasted silently into the shadows of a half-abandoned warehouse lot. The Impala slid between 2 massive shipping containers, completely vanishing into the darkness. Miles turned to Clint, his pulse still hammering. This is your plan? Hiding? Clint reached under his jacket and pulled out something cold, heavy, and way too familiar. A revolver. He flicked the cylinder open, checked the bullets, then snapped it shut. No, my plan is letting them come to us. The hitmen. The 2 black SUVs skidded to a stop at the entrance of the lot, their headlights sweeping over the area like searchlights in a prison yard. Then, doors opened. 4 men stepped out, dressed in black, faces covered, pistols drawn. Miles' stomach twisted. Clint? They're armed. Clint, still crouched, peered at the group through a gap between the containers. Yeah, and? Miles shot him a look. And? That means they're here to kill us, not take us for a joyride. Clint exhaled slowly, adjusting his grip on the revolver. Yeah, well, they don't make hitmen like they used to. One of the men moved toward the containers, his gun raised, his steps cautious. Clint didn't wait. Boom. The first shot rang out like a bomb in the still night. The hitman's head snapped back, his body crumpling like a rag doll. Holy... Miles dropped to the ground, hands over his head as gunfire exploded around them. Pew, pew, pew. Bullets ricocheted off the metal walls, sparks flying, the air filled with the sharp, metallic scent of gunpowder. Miles shouted, "What is happening?" Clint didn't flinch. Survival, kid. Welcome to the real world. Another hitman tried to flank them. Clint caught him mid-step. Bang! The guy dropped. Miles' breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. 2 down. Where are the... Click. Miles' eyes snapped up. One of the remaining hitmen had a grenade in his hand. Oh, you gotta be kidding me. Miles barely had time to react before Clint's jacket went flying. It landed right over the grenade. Boom! The blast sent a shockwave through the lot, dust and debris kicking up into the air. Miles was knocked flat on his back, coughing as the smoke cleared. Through the haze, he saw Clint, leaning against a wall, wiping soot off his face. He gave a tired smirk. Sloppy. They should have just brought a cannon. The 2 remaining hitmen? Gone. Ran for their lives. Miles, still coughing, managed to push himself upright. Did we just win? Clint glanced at the empty street, then shook his head. Nah, kid. That was just a warm-up. The final trial, 8 a.m. The courthouse was a war zone. Reporters swarmed the entrance, cameras flashing, microphones shoved into people's faces. The case of Miles Carter had become national news overnight. Inside, Miles stood in the center of the courtroom, hands still cuffed, his shoulders tense as he faced the judge, the same cold, red-lipped woman from before. Her gaze bored down at him, eyes filled with the same indifference that had almost gotten him locked away for life. "Mr. Carter, do you have any final words before sentencing?" Before Miles could even process what was happening. The doors to the courtroom burst open. The room went silent. Clint Eastwood stepped inside. Miles saw the judge's expression shift. Panic. The prosecutor turned pale. Clint didn't stop walking until he was right in front of the courtroom, holding a thick manila folder. "Miles Carter is innocent." The entire room froze, the judge's lips pressed into a thin line. "And what proof do you have to back up such a bold claim?" Clint grinned. Then he tossed the folder onto the prosecutor's desk. "That folder contains every single dirty transaction linked to Rick Patterson's death." The prosecutor's hands shook as he flipped through the pages. Then Clint pulled out a USB drive. "And this is video footage of two cops admitting they framed Miles Carter." Miles's jaw dropped. The judge went rigid. The prosecutor? He looked like he was about to pass out. The tension in the room could have shattered glass. Clint turned, eyes locking onto Miles. "Told you, kid. Never bet against an old cowboy." The judge sighed heavily, rubbing her temples. Then finally, she raised her gavel. "All charges against Miles Carter are officially dropped." Bang! The gavel hit the wood. And just like that, it was over. The crowd erupted into chaos. Reporters shouting, cameras flashing, people cheering. Miles? He just stood there, staring at Clint. "I don't even know who you are, man, but you just saved my life." Clint chuckled, patting him on the shoulder. "I'm just an old cowboy, kid. And now?" He tipped his imaginary hat. "Let's go celebrate. What would you do in Miles's place? Would you fight back or let the system crush you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Have you or someone you know ever faced injustice like this? Share your experiences. If this story got you thinking, hit the like button and spread the word. The more people see it, the harder it is to ignore the real issues. This isn't just a story. It's a way to shine a light on injustice and start real conversations. The more we talk, the more we push for change.